In tough times, our grandparents and great-grandparents knew something we've nearly forgotten: how to turn humble ingredients into meals that not only filled bellies, but warmed hearts. These 25 poor man's dinners carried families through the Great Depression, wartime rationing, and economic hardship. While they might sound strange to modern ears, these recipes tell the story of American resilience, creativity in the face of scarcity, and the dignity found in making the most of what little you have. Let's rediscover these forgotten meals that our grandparents relied on to survive, and why you might want to add a few to your own dinner rotation. Depression-era soup beans. Picture a cold Appalachian winter night, snow piling against cabin walls while inside, a pot of pinto beans simmers slowly on the wood stove. This wasn't just dinner. It was survival. Dried beans provided cheap protein when meat was unaffordable for mountain families. The secret was in the slow cooking, beans simmering for hours with just a ham bone or bacon rind for flavor, creating a rich broth that transformed the humble bean into something deeply satisfying. The slightly sweet, earthy aroma would fill the entire house, signaling to hungry children that dinner would soon be ready. What made this meal special wasn't fancy ingredients, but time. The patience to let flavors develop slowly. Some families added a pinch of brown sugar or a splash of vinegar right at the end. Served with a slice of cornbread to soak up every last drop of that precious broth, soup beans sustained generations through bitter winters and tight budgets. This simple pot of beans wasn't just food. It was reliable comfort when nothing else was certain. Potato soup. When the cupboard was nearly bare, potato soup emerged as the miracle meal that could stretch a few humble spuds into dinner for an entire family. Depression-era mothers would dice potatoes fine, simmering them in water with a bit of onion until soft. The key was in the mashing. Some potatoes left chunky while others were mashed completely to create a creamy illusion of richness without a drop of cream. For special occasions, a small splash of milk might be added, turning the soup a gentle white that seemed almost luxurious. Children would watch eagerly as the pot bubbled, the starchy aroma promising fullness on nights when hunger seemed inevitable. Some families added a sprinkle of chopped wild greens when available, or a pinch of paprika for color. This wasn't just soup, it was a mother's love made edible, turning the humblest root vegetable into something that could hold a family together through another day of hardship. Bread and milk. Nothing speaks to desperate times like bread and milk. A dinner so simple it barely qualifies as a recipe, yet it sustained countless families when options ran out. Stale bread broken into a bowl with warm milk poured over, top perhaps with a sprinkle of sugar if it could be spared. This humble meal has roots stretching back to medieval times, but during the Depression, it became a last resort dinner that somehow transformed into comfort food. The magic was in warming the milk just enough to soften the bread without making it mushy. Children who grew up during these lean years often continued eating bread and milk throughout their lives, the simple flavors connecting them to childhood even after prosperity returned. When times were especially tight, the bread might be stretched further by adding water to the milk. Somehow, this meal that represented the bare minimum became associated with security, knowing that even at rock bottom, a parent could still provide something warm and filling. Dandelion greens. When grocery money ran out, wise grandmothers turned to their yards instead of the store, harvesting what others considered weeds. Dandelion greens, those same plants modern homeowners wage chemical warfare against, provided vital nutrition during the leanest times. Picked young before flowering, these slightly bitter greens were traditionally washed carefully, then sautéed with a bit of bacon grease or salt pork for flavor. The earthy, slightly peppery taste offered welcome variety when dinner options were monotonous. Rich in vitamins A and C, dandelions helped prevent the deficiency diseases that often accompanied poverty. Families would make collecting them a spring ritual, children helping to gather the tender new leaves while learning crucial foraging skills. Some Italian and Greek immigrant families maintained this tradition even after their financial circumstances improved, recognizing that this weed offered better nutrition than many store-bought vegetables. Dandelion greens weren't just free food, they were nature's multivitamin hiding in plain sight. Salt pork and milk gravy. When meat was an unaffordable luxury, salt pork and milk gravy stretched a sliver of fat into a meal that felt substantial. This Depression staple began with a small cube of salt pork, the cheapest cut available. slowly rendered in a cast-iron skillet until the fat melted into a shimmering pool. Flour would be whisked in to create a roux, then milk added gradually until a thick, creamy gravy formed. The rich, salty gravy poured over biscuits or potatoes created an illusion of abundance from almost nothing. The velvety texture coated the mouth with satisfying richness even when protein was scarce. Some families added black pepper for heat or a pinch of sage when available. Children who grew up with this meal often requested it well into adulthood, not realizing it originated from financial hardship rather than culinary tradition. Salt pork gravy represented kitchen alchemy at its finest, transforming the humblest ingredients into something that felt like comfort even in the hardest times. Hoover stew. Named bitterly after President Hoover during the Great Depression, this improvised stew became a symbol of making do with government relief supplies. Created in Hoovervilles and soup kitchens across America, the stew combined canned hot dogs or hot dog pieces, canned beans, canned corn, and pasta, often macaroni from government cheese boxes. The slightly sweet corn balanced the salty processed meat, creating a oddly harmonious one-pot meal. The starchy pasta and beans made the stew filling enough to quell hunger pangs, while the bits of hot dog provided precious protein when meat was unaffordable. Hot dogs, being highly processed, were often cheaper than fresh meat. Boy Scout troops cooking for homeless communities popularized certain versions, and the recipe spread through relief organizations. What began as desperate improvisation became standardized enough to earn its presidential nickname. Hoover stew reminds us how creativity emerges from scarcity and how communities share cooking knowledge to help each other survive hard times. Creamed chipped beef on toast. Military veterans knew it by less polite names, but creamed chipped beef on toast, or SOS, sustained both soldiers and civilians through depression and wartime rationing. Thinly sliced dried beef, shelf-stable and relatively cheap, was rehydrated and cooked in a simple white sauce, then served over toast. The salty beef provided protein, while the milk-based sauce created satisfying richness and stretched the meat significantly. The creamy, savory mixture, soaking into the crisp toast, created textural contrast that elevated this budget meal beyond its humble ingredients. Military mess halls served it so frequently that returning soldiers brought the recipe home, where it helped stretch ration points during WH-Station. Families would sometimes substitute dried beef with small amounts of leftover meat, finely diced, to seem more abundant. Despite its origins and scarcity, this dish was so beloved that it transcended its budget status, appearing in diners and family restaurants for generations. Creamed chipped beef tells the story of how wartime necessity foods became cultural touchstones. Poor Man's Meal. A true Depression-era classic, Poor Man's Meal represents ingenious simplicity. Diced potatoes and onions fried in a small amount of hot dog slices. Created by Irish immigrant families and perfected during hard times, this one-skillet dinner maximized every calorie from cheap ingredients. The potatoes were cut small to cook quickly and save precious fuel, while the hot dog pieces were sliced thin to distribute their flavor throughout the dish. The magic happened. As the potatoes crisped in the small amount of fat released from the hot dogs, creating satisfying texture and golden caramelization. The sweet onions brought depth to the simple ingredients. Some families added a splash of vinegar at the end, or a few dashes of pepper sauce for brightness. This humble meal filled hungry bellies when paychecks ran short, providing carbohydrates for energy and small amounts of protein from the processed meat. What began as desperate innovation became comfort food, remembered fondly even decades later by children who had grown up during the Depression. Cabbage and noodles. Eastern European immigrants brought this frugal comfort food to America, where it became a Depression-era staple known as haluski. Simple egg noodles tossed with slowly caramelized cabbage created a meal that felt substantial, despite minimal ingredients. The secret was patience, cooking the cabbage long enough to bring out its natural sweetness, transforming a humble vegetable into something richly flavorful. Often made with just butter or bacon drippings for flavor, the dish relied on proper technique rather than expensive additions. The long, slow cooking of the cabbage melted its fibers into sweet, tender strands that clung to the noodles. Families stretched the dish further by adding a bit of sour cream if available, or a pinch of caraway seeds for sophisticated flavor. Affordable, filling, and surprisingly delicious, cabbage and noodles demonstrated how immigrant cooking wisdom helped communities survive economic hardship by transforming the cheapest vegetables into satisfying meals. This dish crossed ethnic boundaries during hard times, becoming part of America's shared culinary heritage. Bean sandwiches. When school lunches needed to be packed but meat was unaffordable, bean sandwiches filled lunch pails across America. Mashed beans, often navy or pinto, were spread between bread slices, creating a protein-packed meal that cost pennies. During the Depression, mothers would often season the beans with a bit of onion, vinegar, or pickle relish to make this humble sandwich more appealing to children. The smooth, creamy texture of well-mashed beans created satisfaction beyond their modest cost. School children carrying these sandwiches received crucial protein for growing bodies when meat was out of reach for many families. Some variations added grated carrots or cabbage for extra nutrition and texture. More than just food, these sandwiches represented parental determination to provide nourishment despite financial constraints. Bean sandwiches tell the story of lunch pail economics, how working-class families ensured their children had the energy to learn and grow even during America's darkest financial hours. Cornmeal mush. Before fancy breakfast cereals lined grocery shelves, cornmeal mush started the day for countless Americans facing hard times. This simple porridge, cornmeal cooked in water until thick, could be served hot for breakfast with a drizzle of molasses, then the leftovers sliced and fried for dinner. The golden crust that formed when frying transformed the humble mush into something that felt like a completely different meal. The versatility of this simple food made it invaluable during the Depression, one inexpensive ingredient becoming two distinct meals. Children often preferred the fried version, crispy on the outside while still creamy inside. Some families added a sprinkle of salt and pepper for a savory dinner version, while others drizzled sorghum or honey for a sweet treat when available. Cornmeal mush represented resourceful cooking at its finest, creating variety from monotony and stretching ingredients to their absolute limit. This humble dish sustained Appalachian families, Midwestern farmers, and urban workers alike through winters when fresh food was scarce. Milkorno. Created by home economists during the Depression, Milkorno became a government-promoted solution to hunger and malnutrition. This simple combination of cornmeal, powdered milk, and water created a nutritionally complete base that could be adapted into dozens of different meals. Promoted through demonstration kitchens and pamphlets, Milkorno taught struggling families how to maximize nutrition with minimal ingredients. The slightly sweet, corny porridge could become pancakes one morning, form the base of a casserole that evening, or become molded loaves similar to polenta the next day. Home economists created recipe booklets showing how a single batch could transform into a week's worth of varied meals. School cafeterias served Milkorno in different guises, ensuring children received essential calcium and protein. This innovation represented scientific approaches to fighting hunger, how nutritional science helped ordinary people survive extraordinary hardship. While largely forgotten today, Milkorno demonstrates how culinary creativity flourished even in America's leanest times. Hamburger soup. When a single pound of ground meat needed to feed a family for days, hamburger soup became the miracle stretcher. Depression and wartime cooks browned a small amount of ground beef, then added diced potatoes, carrots, onions, and whatever garden vegetables were available, creating a hearty soup where the meat flavor permeated every spoonful. Water transformed into broth as the vegetables simmered, creating richness without expensive ingredients. The beauty of this soup was its adaptability. Seasonal vegetables could be rotated, a handful of rice or barley added for extra fullness, or tomatoes included when the garden produced them. Each family developed their own variation based on what was available. The small amount of fat from the hamburger carried flavor throughout the pot, making every vegetable taste richer than it would alone. This soup embodied thrifty wisdom, how to create the feeling of a meat-centered meal while using meat as merely a flavoring ingredient. Hamburger soup tells the story of mathematical cooking, stretching proteins to their absolute limit while maintaining flavor and nutrition. Egg gravy. When protein was scarce but essential for growing children, egg gravy provided an ingenious solution. This simple dish whisked eggs into a basic flour and milk gravy, creating a protein-rich sauce that felt substantial when poured over biscuits or toast. The eggs stretched much further this way than if served alone, turning 2 eggs into a meal for an entire family. The silky, custard-like texture made this budget dinner feel almost luxurious despite its humble ingredients. Some versions added a sprinkle of black pepper or paprika for color and flavor. In farmhouse kitchens, this meal made use of fresh eggs when hens were laying well, providing high-quality protein when meat was unaffordable. Children raised on egg gravy often recalled it fondly in later years, not realizing it originated from financial necessity. This dish represents protein mathematics. How resourceful cooks found ways to maximize nutrition when resources were limited, ensuring growing bodies received what they needed despite economic constraints. Water pie. Dessert seemed impossible during the depths of the Depression, until resourceful bakers created water pie, a magical custard-like dessert made when milk and eggs were luxuries beyond reach. True to its name, the pie used water as its main filling ingredient, combined with a small amount of flour, sugar, vanilla, and butter. During baking, these simple ingredients transformed into a silky, butterscotch-like filling that seemed impossible given its humble components. The alchemy happened during baking, as the butter melted and rose to create a delicate golden top, while the flour and sugar formed a soft custard below. Families saved precious sugar rations for this special treat, often serving it on Sundays or birthdays when celebration was needed most. The pie embodied culinary magic, creating something from nearly nothing through technique rather than expensive ingredients. Water pie tells the story of preserving happiness during hardship, how maintaining small pleasures and celebrations helped families maintain dignity and joy even in desperate times. Slumgullion. With a name as colorful as its history, Slumgullion emerged from mining camps before becoming Depression-era salvation. This hearty hodgepodge combined whatever ingredients were available, typically macaroni or rice, small amounts of ground meat, canned tomatoes, and any vegetables on hand. The dish got its name from mining slang for the muddy residue in mining sluices, but it tasted far better than its humble name suggested. The genius was in the one-pot cooking method, where each ingredient contributed to a tomato-tinged sauce that bound everything together. During the Depression, this flexible format allowed families to use whatever was available or affordable that week. Sometimes the meat was replaced with beans when money was particularly tight. The filling combination of proteins and carbohydrates made this an ideal meal for those doing physical labor. Slumgullion represents adaptive cooking, creating reliable meals from unreliable resources and finding ways to make varied ingredients work harmoniously together, even when choices were limited by circumstance. Milk toast. When illness struck, but medicine was unaffordable, milk toast became both comfort food and folk remedy. This gentle meal of toasted bread and warm, sweetened milk was traditionally served to invalids and children recovering from illness. During the Depression, it became everyday fare for many families, providing calcium and carbohydrates when little else was available. The comforting warmth and soft texture made this simple dish feel nurturing despite its modest ingredients. Some mothers added a small pat of butter or a sprinkle of cinnamon when available, transforming necessity into something children requested even in better times. Beyond nutrition, milk toast represented care, how parents created comfort for their families even when they couldn't provide material abundance. This humble dish appears frequently in Depression-era memoirs, often described with surprising fondness given its simplicity. Milk toast tells the story of nurturing during hardship, how the ritual of care embedded in food preparation became as important as the ingredients themselves. Rabbit stew. When the garden failed and store credit ran out, Depression-era families often turned to hunting for survival. Rabbit stew transformed lean wild game into rich, satisfying meals through slow cooking with garden vegetables. Fathers and sons would hunt rabbits in the early mornings, bringing home precious protein that cost only the price of shotgun shells or snare wire. The lean meat required careful cooking, long and slow with plenty of liquid to prevent toughness. Onions, carrots, potatoes, and whatever vegetables the garden produced would join the pot, absorbing the delicate flavor of the game. Some families added a pinch of herbs gathered from the roadside, wild sage or thyme. This meal represented self-reliance at its most fundamental, the ability to feed a family from the land when economic systems failed. Rabbit stew tells the story of survival skills, how traditional hunting and cooking knowledge helped families weather economic collapse by returning to older ways of procuring food. Garbage soup, despite its unappetizing name. Garbage soup represented resourcefulness rather than desperation. Depression-era homemakers saved every food scrap, vegetable peelings, meat bones, wilting greens, in a container in the icebox. When full, these would become soup stock, simmered for hours to extract every bit of flavor and nutrition before the solids were strained out. This thrifty practice turned what might be wasted into the foundation for nourishing meals. The rich, complex flavor of these stocks often surpassed store-bought versions, as they contained a diversity of ingredients collected over days. Families would add a handful of rice, beans, or diced potatoes to the finished broth, creating a complete meal from what would otherwise be thrown away. This practice crossed cultural and class lines during the Depression, becoming standard kitchen wisdom in many households. Garbage soup represents zero-waste cooking before it was fashionable, how economic necessity created sustainable practices that modern cooks are now rediscovering with environmental motivation. Pressed meat. Scraps of meat alone weren't enough for a meal. Enterprising cooks created pressed meat, a forerunner to modern luncheon meats but made at home from necessity. Small bits of meat left over from other meals would be finely chopped, mixed with breadcrumbs or cooked cereals, shaped into a loaf, then weighted down and chilled until firm. This technique transformed meat scraps that might serve one person into a sliceable loaf that could feed a family for days. The pressed loaf would be sliced thin and served cold, or fried in thin slices to create the illusion of proper meat portions. Herbs from the garden, parsley, sage, or thyme, added flavor while stretching the meat further. This practical preparation allowed families to save protein bits throughout the week, creating one substantial meal from what would otherwise be inadequate portions. Pressed meat exemplifies cumulative cooking, how saving and transforming small amounts of ingredients over time could create significant meals when immediate resources were insufficient. Onion sandwiches. When meat for sandwiches was an unattainable luxury, the humble onion sandwich provided flavor and substance for lunch pails across America. Thin, sliced sweet onions between bread, spread with a bit of butter or dripping, sprinkled with salt and pepper, created a sandwich that was anything but boring. The crisp texture and pungent flavor made this simple meal satisfying in a way modern eaters might find surprising. Some workers preferred their onion sliced thick for substantial crunch, while others soaked thin slices briefly in cold water to remove some bite. This wasn't just a sandwich, it was practical nutrition, providing energy through carbohydrates and antibacterial properties from the raw onion during cold and flu season. Coal miners and factory workers particularly favored these sandwiches, as the strong smell discouraged others from stealing their lunch. Onion sandwiches represent sensory satisfaction during scarcity, how strong flavors could create fulfillment when calories alone were insufficient. Codfish gravy. In coastal communities where fishing sustained generations, codfish gravy turned humble preserved fish into a meal that could feed an entire family. Salt cod, preserved for long storage without refrigeration, would be soaked overnight to remove excess salt, then flaked and stirred into a simple white sauce made with flour, fat, and milk or water. This creamy mixture poured over potatoes or toast stretched protein in a way that felt substantial. The slightly sweet, oceanic flavor of the cod permeated the white sauce, creating a satisfying richness beyond its simple ingredients. families, added whatever enhancements were available, perhaps diced hard-boiled eggs from the family henhouse or garden herbs in season. This meal connected coastal communities to their fishing heritage even when fresh catch was unaffordable. Codfish gravy represents cultural continuity during hardship, how traditional preparations evolved to meet economic constraints while maintaining connections to regional identity and food heritage. Meatloaf miracle. The legendary stretcher. Of modest meat portions, Depression-era meatloaf bore little resemblance to today's all-beef versions. These resourceful loaves combined small amounts of ground meat with bread soaked in milk, rolled oats, grated vegetables, and eggs when available, creating a substantial dinner from ingredients that would make only a few sparse burgers. The genius was in the binding ingredients, which absorbed the meat flavors throughout the loaf, creating the satisfaction of a meat-centered meal while using meat primarily as flavoring. Grated carrots, onions, and even apples added moisture and nutrition while stretching the protein further. Some recipes included a small amount of cheese rind grated fine for flavor. A thin tomato glaze made from thinned tomato soup created a special finish that made this economical dinner feel like a proper Sunday meal. Meatloaf represents transformative cooking, how binding agents and complementary ingredients could fundamentally change the nature of a protein, creating abundance. From scarcity. Foraged fish stew. Along rivers and coastlines, families survived lean times by returning to ancient fishing practices combined with foraged greens and wild herbs. Fish that commercial operations rejected became sustenance for struggling families. Small panfish, trash fish rejected by markets, or whatever could be caught with simple gear. Combined with wild onions, dandelion greens, and herbs growing along watersheds, these humble ingredients became nourishing stews. The clear, light broth allowed the delicate flavor of small fish to shine, while wild greens added complexity and vital nutrition. Some regional variations included acorns ground into meal as thickener, drawing on Native American traditions. This meal represented the ultimate local eating, sustenance drawn entirely from one's immediate environment when commercial food systems were unaffordable. Foraged fish stew tells the story of environmental knowledge, how understanding local ecosystems provided survival pathways during economic collapse. Bread pudding. When bread went stale but couldn't be wasted, bread pudding transformed potential garbage into a dessert that felt like pure luxury. Depression-era families collected bread ends and stale slices throughout the week, then soaked them in a mixture of milk, sugar, and perhaps a precious egg for Sunday dessert. The humble ingredients underwent magical transformation in the oven, creating soft, custardy comfort food. Vanilla saved from better times might add special flavor, or perhaps cinnamon or nutmeg for warmth. The contrast between the soft interior and slightly caramelized top created textural interest beyond the simple ingredients. Families sometimes added foraged berries or dried fruit when available, creating seasonal variation. This thrifty dessert embodies transformative cooking at its finest, turning food waste into celebration. Bread pudding reminds us that resourcefulness is timeless and that delicious meals can come from humble beginnings. In rediscovering these forgotten meals from harder times, we're not just looking back. We're recovering valuable wisdom about resourcefulness, creativity in the kitchen, and finding satisfaction in simplicity. Our grandparents didn't just survive these tough times. They created food traditions that sustained not only bodies, but spirits. In today's world of rising food costs and economic uncertainty, these recipes offer practical solutions and a reminder that good food isn't about expensive ingredients, but about care and creativity in preparation. If you've enjoyed this journey through America's hidden food history, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more forgotten wisdom from previous generations. Let us know in the comments which of these poor man's dinners you remember from your family traditions, or which one you'd like to try. Until next time, remember that between simple ingredients lies not just a meal, but a connection to the quiet heroism of everyday survival that defined much of our shared history.